Ladies and gentlemen, on all the videos that we've made about trades and guys and the Montreal Canadiens, I regret to inform you that I missed this. Because today, we are reopening the can of worms that is Montreal and Boston. The two teams that are actually at the Atlantic Division's peak at the moment. Montreal has 22 points in 15 games. Boston has 20 points in 17 games. Via points percentage, the Bruins aren't technically second. They're fourth. But the Boston Bruins are still going through a pretty good stint to open up this season. They've won 6 games in a row. It's looking pretty good for the Bees, and there is a very particular trade update that I do think is worth talking about. Because let's just say the Boston Bruins, who have started off the year pretty hot, don't end up in this position right here by the time the season is halfway through, for example. Let's say that some of these other teams with higher points percentages really start to kick it into gear. Let's say Florida wakes up. Let's say Toronto starts to get it together post Mitch Marner. Let's say the Bruins fall out of contention. At that point, one may beg the question as to whether or not certain centers are going to be available on the trade market, and that includes Pavel Zacha. Now, we have made videos about Zacha in the past, and I know this is an illy timed commentary because the Bruins have been doing so well. Pavel Zacha has been doing pretty alright too. He's at 14 points in 17 games played this season, on pace for about 67 points. That would be a career high for the former top pick in 2015's NHL Entry Draft. But Zacha is in a pretty interesting spot because for most of the year, the Boston Bruins were labeled as this team that wasn't really all too good, and they were kind of down in the dumps in the earlier parts of the year. I mean, you see all the losses piling up over here. Then they started to win games, and Pavel Zacha has been a very consistent point producer in these overtime, shootout, and regulation wins at the hands of the Boston Bruins. But we still do have some updates that I do think are worth mentioning in regards to Zacha and the Montreal Canadiens. I wanted to leave a link in the description to this article posted onto TVA Sports 6 days ago by Nick Kluche. It talks about some clear links between Pavel Zacha and the Montreal Canadiens. And believe me, when I say links, it's like, all right, well, there's a very obvious link between Pavel Zacha and the Habs. I don't think we've mentioned it specifically, but there is one obvious link that is there. However, this article does go out there and dive into even more that I thought was interesting here. So let's go out there and read this piece. It's linked in the description. It's originally published in French, but I've translated it to English via the Google machine. The last time the Montreal Canadiens and the Boston Bruins made a player trade, Lucien Bouchard re-signed as the Premier of Quebec, and Apple launched the iPod. Eric Weinrich went to Boston in exchange for Patrick Travers, a one-for-one deal. A trade between the Bruins and the Canadiens is as counterintuitive as giving your PIN number to your worst enemy. But if anyone can end this drought, it's surely Kent Hughes, the sly fox from Beaconsfield who had a great career as an agent in the Boston area. One of the worst-kept secrets in the NHL is that Hughes adores Bruins center Pavel Zacha. Hughes represented Zacha for Cortex, an agency he only agreed to leave to become GM in Montreal after much deliberation. So, right away, that's the first link that you can say, all right, well, Kent Hughes was the guy's agent at a time, so there obviously is some familiarity, and Kent Hughes obviously knows the client inside and out. He was there as Pavel Zacha was a New Jersey Devil and inevitably became good again when he was in Boston. So, actually, no, that was already Kent Hughes at that time. Yeah, no, never mind, I take that back. But Kent Hughes knows what Pavel Zacha is about, and that is a very clear link. But the next part of the piece is even more interesting. Trustworthy sources within the NHL assured us that Montreal is not on the list of teams that Zacha would refuse to be traded to. Quite the opposite. In fact, apparently, there are a few Czech players in the league who dream of playing in Montreal too. I'll leave it at that. The NHL's second worst kept secret. The Canadiens need a second-line center. Discussions took place over the summer, including one about Zacha. Follow-up talks are planned when clubs decide to sell. But hey, leave it to Nick Cloutier to give us a scoop that I think will get most Montreal Canadiens fans excited, learning that Czech players around the NHL do want to play with the Canadiens, and they want to play in Montreal too. Are we going to sit here and assume that Pavel Zacha, who does not want to not be traded to Montreal, would in fact welcome and be interested in a trade to the Canadiens? I mean, Czech players around the National Hockey League, obviously the most intriguing and direct one that you can bring up is Jakub Dobeš. He's from Czechia, he's from Ostrava, so obviously there's a link there. But, there are a number of really interesting Czech players around the National Hockey League, and specifically ones in Boston that happen to be very interesting and, quite talented at that. Okay, we're not going to dive into that, sorry. If you're watching the video, you kind of saw who it is we're talking about, but no, sorry, it's not going to be David Pastrnak. Pavel Zacha is probably the guy that I think Kent Hughes and co. have their eyes on the most when it comes to Czech Boston Bruins players. But the article continues here after that. Oliver Kapanen is a surprise at center and has some things in common with Ivan Demidov. So much the better, the situation remains unchanged. Because Demidov remains relatively underutilized at even strength, if Martin St. Louis could pair an experienced center with the Russian, it would be a completely different story. Zacha ticks so many boxes for the Canadiens. Superb contract, only $4.7 per year till 2027. Versatile, talented, responsible defensively. But he is also one of the good friends of his compatriot David Pastrnak, whom they don't want to upset for fun in Boston. Zacha wouldn't revolutionize hockey in Montreal like Crosby. Besides, Montreal already has a number one center. Zacha would be filling a gaping hole and bringing the Canadiens closer to being contenders. For Hughes, it would be a brilliant move to snatch him away from his sworn enemy. And then there is a conversation about supply and demand. There are a number of other teams that are interested in centers, and there are other guys that have been tossed out there. Nazem Kadri, Calgary, Gavin McKenna, head over down, Ryan O'Reilly, yada, yada, yada. We already made some commentaries about O'Reilly the past few weeks here. But either way, Pavel Zacha, potentially interested in a Montreal Canadiens trade, a guy who would welcome, supposedly, the idea of being a Canadian. Who really knows if that's fully contextualized there? But for now, we're just going to roll with it. The way the article is presented and the way that it was talked about by Cloutier, I do think it's reasonable to conclude from that text that Pavel Zacha would be interested in a trade to Montreal. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below about this potential Montreal and Boston trade update. I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.